Well, welcome and thank you for joining us in the series Words of Life that we're basing off the book by Nijay Gupta, 15 New Testament Words of Life. And thank you, because this is actually, even though it's part of our series, it's our kind of Good Friday video. So if you're watching this video is released on Good Friday. And so we really thought like the word that probably would best associate as we talk about this and we celebrate this time is the cross.
That makes sense.
It does make a lot of sense. And it's important to me to reflect on that today. And so, yeah, we're going to kind of jump right into that in the fact that the cross is something that would have been quite frequently referenced to in the New Testament.
Yep.
And it's a symbol of both hope and redemption. So
but only because of what Jesus did.
Only because, yeah, we'll get into that.
Okay.
We'll get into that. We'll get into that, like which and just that. But
Yeah.
so to kind of give it, the idea of redemption. We'll start with the story, kind of a brief look at the story of God, which is, the idea of creation, the fall, redemption, participation, and restoration. And so when we start off with the idea of, again, the story of God creating the world, humanity, us, doing so in his image and establishing a relationship with him, us with each other, and us also with just creation itself.
Yeah, the land.
As a result of humanity's choice, her disobedience or lacking their trust in God, they look elsewhere for identity, purpose, and truth, which becomes a disordering of relationships kind of just all around.
So that's not what God intended.
That's not what God intended. That's where we get to that sin thing.
The sin thing, yeah.
Missing the mark.
Yeah.
We're missing the mark on relationships just everywhere.
Okay, so, and again, we know the result of this missing the mark or sin is death.
Is death, yeah.
So the consequence or penalty of sin is death. And it's not just physical death, but Jeff Vanderstelt says it's a spiritual, relational, and physical death and destruction affect all of these things.
Yes, every one of them. And I think that's really important, because I think sometimes we just see it in the physical realm.
Yeah.
And sometimes even just the spiritual realm, but it's a relational realm.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
again, it's not just our relationship with God, but our relationship with each other. And creation itself. And that's when we have Jesus. This is where kind of, again, what we're celebrating on Good Friday. And I'm going to quote from Kate Boyd here. It says, from Untidy Faith. It says, Jesus, being fully God and fully man, would disrupt the cycle of sin forever and make a way for a full spiritual restoration and initiate the future completion of a physical restoration of the world.
Yeah.
And I would want to add, there's a relational restoration. It's a reordering, not only to God, but again to each other and to creation.
And to creation, yeah. And that's those are the two things we often overlook, is to each other,
yes,
to other people, and to creation.
And to creation.
So I think we, as followers of Jesus, need to take our role in what's happening to our planet very seriously.
Very much so. And so then, so when we talk about a lot of this time on Good Friday, we are talking about celebrating that we are being freed. We've been freed from the penalty of sin, and we are in the process of being freed from the power of sin. Right. And I think Peter writes this really great in 1 Peter 2:24. He personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. And then by his wounds you are healed. And so so it's we are redeemed not only in the way we think. I think sometimes we really emphasize that part, and though it's important, but also in the way we live. Yeah,
and that goes along with understanding the word faith or belief. Yeah. And so that's how we think. And then the result of that should translate into a change of behavior or actions, or like you said, the way we live. So.
Yeah. And I think it's really important that we take these times, Good Friday, especially, to contemplate the cross, because I think we can rush through the cross to kind of get to resurrection.
Yeah.
Like there's like famous things like, Friday, we got to get to Sunday kind of thing. And it's the idea of like, yes, we can understand that because we should all love the idea of life and the power and the resurrection of life, but we really can't miss and rush past the significance of the cross as well.
Yeah, there is no redemption without the cross.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we are to relate to it. And I think that's a really important thing.
But it's an easy thing to overlook because it's a little darker.
Yep.
And for some people, it's actually depressing. And I understand that. It is a dark and depressing thing. The circumstances about what happened to Jesus and the sort of context of redemption. And we always look forward to the positive, which is the resurrection.
Yeah. So I think with all this, like in the midst of this chapter, Nijay poses a really great question, and that's why a cross?
Mm-hmm.
And I realize I don't think I've necessarily kind of, I guess, processed with that question, why a cross? Like I've definitely thought about it a little bit, but just what a great idea. Because the fact that it has become a symbol of hope now would have been utter foolishness in the first century.
Yeah. Well, I just think of a first century person looking at people today wearing crosses on jewelry or seeing crosses on churches. To them, the cross was a symbol of execution to anybody who opposed the Roman government. And so they would have thought it was absolutely absurd.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of to go further down that, it's the idea, because there are many ways that they were executing people. And then so they again poses the questions, why a cross? What that significance is.
Yeah.
And first we can go back to like Paul, in Galatians 3:13, kind of relates to Jesus hanging the cross to Deuteronomy 21:23, which is curses everyone who is hung on a tree. So we have that significance right there as a cursed way to die. But when we look at the cross, why it was execution, and why it would have been chosen as such is because it was considered a humiliating execution.
Yeah, it isn't just an execution. Chopping off your head is an execution.
Yeah. And they could have done that.
They could, and I'm sure I think the Apostle Paul was beheaded. So I think crucifixion was reserved for the worst kind of crime, and the worst kind of crime to a Roman was opposing any kind of Roman authority.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think we do, with that idea of a humiliation, I think the idea of cursed also, in that becomes a little bit more of a, an accurate understanding of what's going on there. Because, it was reserved for political enemies of Rome.
And they wanted everybody to see what would happen to those people who opposed Rome.
Yep.
So when you were executed on a cross, it was typically done on the pathway leading into the city.
Yeah.
And
very visible place.
Very visible place. And you had to walk by them every time you went in and out of the city. And there was always a Roman presence there to let you in and out of the city. So it was a real power move on Rome's part to do it that way.
It absolutely was. And then, quite often we hear the stories of Jesus is surrounded by two men.
Yeah.
And quite often some translations will say thieves.
Yeah.
And Brian Wintle writes that a better translation is actually rebels.
Yeah.
Like they wouldn't have been thieves. Could be just like, they stole a loaf of bread or something like that. That's like, wow, that's what happened when or something like that. Their crimes was even if there was some sort of stealing involved, the crime was rebellion.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot more sense. I know in the translation I read for my daily reading, we're actually reading about this today, and they use the word criminals, as opposed to thieves. Yeah,
and it's better with that sort of.
That's
idea.
more of a literal translation, but we have to understand that crucifixion was reserved for rebels.
And so, the point is not just to execute, but also to send a message that would hopefully deter. Because they're going to be like, they're whatever, whether it's, followers or people in their group, because they're going to deter because it's a horrible torture. They would slowly die.
And slow. That's like days. Lots of times.
And people would watch and mock. It's highly visible, highly humiliating. They were naked. They're restrained, and just, it's a horrific death.
Yeah.
And
just to be in pain for that long, and to have the public be on public display for people to watch you, it's too much to even imagine.
Yeah, and it would, especially in the idea that, especially, I mean, it's no different today, but definitely in that time, social structure was a big thing. Like even those low on the social structure are like, at least I'm not them.
Yeah.
Like this is, nobody would want to be anyone who is experiencing that and the humiliation that was it there. So why the cross? Because it's not just a death; it's a humiliating, shameful death, which really kind of, I think, adds, when we say that he took our shame to the cross.
Yeah.
Because the cross was literally a shameful experience.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some of that weight to it. And so now the cross is a symbol of hope and redemption, and Jesus completely reframed that.
And that fits right along with Jesus' message about an upside down kingdom. He's taking something that is a horrific way to die and changes it to be a symbol of hope and redemption.
Yeah, and I think it just leads us to, like, Jesus himself saying, take up your cross and follow me.
Yeah.
Hey, what does that mean? And it is, that Jesus, when you look at that, he's been preparing people to kind of do that through his life ministry, whether it's on the Sermon on the Mount or even things where he corrects James and John, his two of his followers, and some of his closest followers, when they ask if they could sit at his right and left hands, which leads Jesus to reference, to tell all his disciples, encourage them that if they want to be great, they have to be a servant and be a servant to all.
Yeah, this seemed to be a big thing with the disciples, because it's in the Gospels. It's mentioned several times that this was a common argument that they would bring up over and over again. And Jesus seems to correct them every time, but it still comes up.
Yeah.
So it obviously was something that they struggle with, I think, as we all do. But again, Jesus very clearly says that in order to be someone in his kingdom, you need to be a servant, and not just to people of equal station to you, but to all.
Yeah, and I think that's would have been very much a societal structure understanding that they would have had. Just like, what can I do to get myself elevated?
Yeah.
And understandably, I mean, they're just saying, like, hey, this is the guy that's doing miracles and raising people from the dead. I'm connected to him. You know, like that's a pretty, like, if everyone knows that I'm connected to that guy, what's that? I mean, that gives me a lot of, like, like a societal
status.
Status and societal
possibly
currency
power,
and
possibly money. Yeah.
Well, I'm more maybe money, but just societal currency. Like, just
absolutely.
Like, you're just like, oh, like, wow, that's guy. And
so, Nijay in the book goes on to talk about being shaped by the cross. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, and I think that's where we think the idea of the cross is that we, as much as we need to be transformed by the power of the cross, going back to the idea of redemption, that's so important. The idea of taking up the cross, we are also to be transformed by the demonstration of the cross. So it's supposed to shape us, and it's. And I guess the theological term that is used is cruciformed.
Okay.
Which is really just, again, being shaped by the cross. And so because of that, it should shape our understanding and cause us to rethink things like, we just talked about social status, love. Instead of focusing on our own rising up the social ladder, it becomes about a place of equal honor and care. And we see that when Paul writes to the Corinthians, when and he's not really happy with how they're performing the kind of communion or that meal together, and that they're creating divisions, and that they're using societal structures where, like, like the best place for, like, the higher you are, you got good places, and of course there's the richer and the more status, and they're creating that structure still in that. And he's just saying, hey, in the kingdom of God, that structure doesn't exist. We all are honored together, and we have equal honoring and care happen in the kingdom of God.
So I think that would cause us to rethink then lots of different things: how we love people, how we demonstrate that love, that it might actually cost us something. Lots of times we're willing to love people or even be generous as long as it doesn't cost us too much, or it comes out of our excess. But this is something a little bit different than that.
Yeah, it is definitely the idea of, rethinking love that's shaped by the cross. It is a love that's costly and a love that's generous.
Yeah.
It's,
So give us an example of that.
Well, the example that Nijay uses in the book, and just sort of like, which he relates to the cross, is Jesus actively demonstrated sort of, I guess the cross in the everyday life, because
Yeah.
The idea is and that was when he washed the feet of his disciples.
Okay, I get it. And so Jesus is taking he was the teacher, his students or whatever are of a lower in that culture would have been lower status than him.
For sure. Yeah.
But we enter a person's house, someone needed to wash your feet, and that was reserved for the lowest person on the servant's totem pole.
Yeah.
And yet Jesus takes off his outer robe, puts a towel around his waist, and washes his disciples' feet.
Yeah, it would have been seen as a shameful role.
Well, it's so shameful that when it comes to describing how Peter reacts to it, it makes Peter very uncomfortable.
He's really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it's not just sort of like, he washed my feet. It's because the fact that he would take this role and when it describes him taking off the outer garment and all that, like he's making himself look like a slave and then do the act of that. Like the teacher was not supposed to do that. I mean, a teacher wouldn't even ask a student to do that for him. And it does have that relation to, again, the cross, that when Jesus, it's this humiliating experience of execution. Well, here is really would have been seen as a humiliating position.
So in Peter's mind, Jesus is making himself or puts himself in a role that would bring shame to the honor of a teacher.
Yeah. And I think sometimes I think I can miss it, is that it would have been utterly shocking for Peter to see that and the disciples to see that. Yeah,
we've heard the story so much it doesn't affect us the same way.
Yeah, and I think we don't necessarily have some of that, understanding like, you would never do that. I won't washing each other's feet or anything like that, but like just that sort of understanding. Like, it was like, it would have been like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Moment. And this points to what really love is, and love, becomes one of self-giving. Nijay writes, spending oneself to protect, preserve, and bless the other.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes a love that is generous and open. A love being demonstrated by not putting the spotlight on you, because that's actually greed. Basically you're trying to, when we're trying to make like, well, we're making it about us, people kind of like see how we're doing this, and like even we see that becomes a big thing with Jesus with a lot of religious leaders, and how they're just, how they are going around in their worship. It's still like really putting the spotlight on themselves, and for him to even say like, hey, by doing that, they've got their reward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that reminds me of the parable from our last series where you got the two people praying, the Pharisee and the tax man.
Yeah.
And the Pharisee's prayer is really not to God. It's just telling himself how great he is.
Well, look how much I love.
And look how much money I've given.
Exactly.
I'm not like that guy over there. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in talking about this story, the disciples washing the feet, Nijay Gupta he writes this. He goes, Jesus' lesson was not about the feet, water, towels, dirt per se.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually about the cross. It was about loving the other in such a way that sometimes we take on the role of a lowly slave to serve them. So it is really a loving our neighbor. It's not about what we get out of it.
Yeah.
It's loving in such a way that actually benefits the neighbor.
Yeah. And I think that can happen sometimes. We do something good hoping it's going to make us look better.
Yeah.
And really the intention here is to do something that benefits the other person for their sake.
And maybe it won't make you look good at all.
Yeah.
That's, like that's not the goal of it.
Yeah.
And so it is, a love shaped by the cross that's demonstrated in him and in what exactly the cross was.
Mm-hmm.
In like his self-sacrificing love, and that, it's not just, it wasn't like a simple execution. It was such a low status that but it was still self-sacrifice. He willingly went there. So we're, again, we are to be transformed by the power of the cross that restores identity.
It gives us almost a new identity.
Yeah.
And I really like that idea that being shaped by the cross changes who we are to the point where people will notice a change in us.
That's right.
And
so we need to be shaped and transformed by Jesus' demonstration with the cross.
Which helps us, or I think another way to say that is we become more like.
Exactly what we're doing. It's becoming more like Jesus.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's really important in Good Friday, wherever you find yourself, just kind of think about that, what Jesus has done, and that self-giving love that was really for us, and that he really wants us to, again, that he demonstrated with the cross, but he also just sort of gave us a little bit more tangible maybe idea when it comes to washing the feet, of the disciples, that we're to serve one another.
Serve one another, yeah.
And that's what we want to do.
Well, hopefully you found something that challenged you maybe a little bit about this particular podcast. And again, on Good Friday, I think it's extremely important that we take time to remember Jesus and the sacrifice he made. And this kind of makes it a little more real for me anyway, just thinking through what crucifixion actually was and what it means, and the fact that this was a key part of redemption. So hopefully you found it at least interesting and hopefully helpful. I know it's always helpful for me to discuss some things, or maybe ask questions to some other people. If you have a friend you can talk through this with, or maybe if you're part of our church community, to be asking in your missional communities, who meet in homes during the week, all about some of the things we've been talking about here today. And we truly wish that this Good Friday is a time for you to, again, make a direct connection with Jesus if you're a follower of Jesus. And maybe if you've strayed a little bit, this is a chance for you to reconnect. And again, we love making these podcasts for you. And please like and subscribe to our channel so we can continue to do so. Thanks again for watching, and we'll hopefully see you again next time.